Let's do attendance. So Alexis de Tocqueville, not a founding father or founding mother for that matter. Tocqueville comes to America in the 1830s, right around 1830. And he is here to study democracy in America. By 1830, our Constitution now has been running for, let's see, 30, 40, it's been running for 41 years and doing a pretty good job. France, you might remember, has their revolution just shortly after the American Revolution, so they're 1790s. And by 1830, they've had almost a dozen versions of their constitution. Like oh, we tried that, didn't work. We tried this, it didn't work. Tried this, it didn't work. And Tocqueville's like fascinated with the fact that it's working in America. And so he's like, I want to go find out why it's working in America. So, he needs funding to do this. So, goes to the government to ask for funding, and they're all, no, we're not going to send you. We're not going to pay for you to go study democracy in America, because that would be like admitting we don't know what we're doing over here. And so he says, well, how about this? What if I go to study the penitentiary system? And they said, yeah, we could get behind that. And so, like to this day, France views prisons differently than we do in America. There are really two reasons for prisons in France. One is to separate offenders from the populace, and two is for punishment. And at least here in America, we have an ostensible third reason, which is rehabilitation. It turns out we're not very good at rehabilitation. But we just started this in the early 1800s with a way of incarcerating offenders called the penitentiary system. What's the difference between a penitentiary and a prison? We use them as synonyms today. What's the difference? The penitentiary is supposed to make someone penitent. It's supposed to help them to change their lives and become different. So they pay him to come for a year to come and study the penitentiary system in America. He spends 2 months studying the penitentiary system, enough to write his report, and then he's off for the next 10 months to study democracy in America, which is what he came to study, really wanted to study in the first place. And so he goes around, travels all around America, trying to figure out, why does democracy work over here? And so the book that he wrote, the 2-volume series, Democracy in America, it is widely regarded as the best book ever written on American democracy, written by a Frenchman. And part of the reason is that anytime that Americans try to write about democracy, we don't really understand, kind of how much of the, kind of what's happening in the background that we just take for granted. And for him, it was all different. And so he's writing about things that other authors aren't writing about. And this is one of the things that we would have taken for granted in the early 1830s, that when he comes to study democracy in America, he's like, this is absurd. This is crazy. He says there's hardly a pioneer's hut which does not contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare. Why does he even think this is worth mentioning in a book about American democracy? Any thoughts? No? Yeah, seems like a strange thing to mention. He's amazed because what he's saying is that these people can read. What's the literacy rate in America at this time? Any idea? If you're a man in an urban area, it's about a 95% likelihood that you can read and write. Women in urban areas, about 75%. If we go to rural areas, those numbers drop by about 20%. And so what it means is that wherever you went, if you were free, you were more likely to be able to read than not. What's the literacy rate in France at this time? 5%. 5%. And that's kind of throughout Europe. Between 5 and 8% is the literacy rate. And why do we feel so strongly about reading in America? We want everyone to be able to read. Why? Do you know? Yeah, go ahead. So this is exactly, so the comment was, well, you must not be informed if you can't read and write. And this really must be really important to democracy. And that's exactly what Tocqueville figures out, but that's not the reason that we want people to read and write. What's the reason that we want people to read and write in America? Why do we have this crazy literacy rate? I mean, there's nowhere else in the world that has a literacy rate even close to this. Scotland is close, but nowhere else. It's to be able to engage the Word of God for every individual to be able to engage the Word of God. That's the reason. Anyway, and he identifies this as one of the main reasons that democracy is working in America. And this really is one of the things that made Americans different from Europeans, is this this literacy. By the way, by 1776, how many British colonies are there on mainland North America? You know, you might think of the early flag of the United States of America and have some close estimate for what that is. You might think there's 13, but actually there's 14. There's 14 colonies. One of them is in Canada. Thank you, Quincy, for bringing up Canada today. And it's only been a British colony since 1765 at the end of the French Indian War. So it was a French colony, and after the war, it became a British colony. But what's the literacy rate in, it's called Nova Scotia, but what's the literacy rate in Nova Scotia? About 5%. And we in America, or in the British colonies, the 13 colonies, we can't understand why those guys in Nova Scotia don't just want to sign up and join with us in separating from England. Because we have been doing the reading and the philosophy and this idea of natural rights, and we think this is just like self-evident, but it's not self-evident if you are, illiterate in Nova Scotia. You're afraid of the government and you just don't want to get involved. And so we made two different attempts during the American Revolution to kind of go and liberate Canada. They did not want to be liberated. And so, and we just didn't understand because the culture was so different. I was really surprised to find out when I lived in New Orleans that the literacy rate among adults in New Orleans, this is absurd, 48%. Most adults in New Orleans at that time, I don't know, it might have changed substantially after Katrina, but at that time, most adults in New Orleans were illiterate. It's like, whoa. Anyway, so kind of how we felt about education was really different in America than other places. All right, we'll save that and we will move on. Oh, what do we have going on today? Oh, pivot tables. So we've got a file to download today. Where is pivot tables? We are the 15th, working with pivot tables. So this file to download, and this is actually the same data that we worked with last time we were together. So last time we were looking at, what was it? Crimes known to law enforcement. So crimes that were reported on university campuses across the country. We were looking at the raw data files. And so today we're going to be using that same data for looking at pivot tables. Now, of course, I'm guessing that most of you are familiar with pivot tables. Just show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how comfortable you are working with pivot tables. Now, 5, 4, 5, 4, 3, 5, 4, 3, 3, 5, 5, 5. Yeah, okay. Was that 2? Yeah, it was 4. Okay, so yeah, when I first started teaching this stuff, I don't know, must have, here at BYU, so around 2000, early, before 2010. Wow, pivot tables are like something that college students still didn't know about, but I guess you're getting this, somewhere else. And we're not really focusing on pivot tables today. We are focusing on automating pivot tables today. So the fact that you're already comfortable with pivot tables is going to be a great plus for you today. So let's just kind of take a look at this data and just kind of see what we're dealing with here. So if I look at, we've got multiple years. Looks like 2006 is at the top. And how many rows do we have? About 20,000 rows or so, down to 2010 data here. And if I look right here, 2006, Alabama, Auburn University. So this is like data from this is one line of those files that we looked at on Monday. So this shows one school and it shows all of these categories. So their enrollment was 5,000 students and they reported only one crime. There was 8 counts of larceny. Sounds like a pretty great place to go to school. I don't know if they're reporting everything, but that sounds pretty good. Go over to Jacksonville University. I would expect Jacksonville University to be similar in size. Well, it's not, well, I guess it shows it right here. So it's not twice in size, but wow, way more larceny, way more burglary. And so if we were to look at all of Alabama, that would be, one file. All of Alabama 2006, that's one file. So ultimately, this is what you're doing in that database project when you get to it, is you're reading that source data and you're going to be bringing into a database file in a similar format here. So one row per number. Well, let's suppose that like our task is that we have, we're somewhere in university administration and we're interested in crime and comparing how we're doing with other schools. And so we get this data from the FBI. And we regularly need to build some pivot tables on it. And so some of the people that we're working with, they don't know about Excel and pivot tables, but we want to be able to pre-build maybe several different pivot tables to be able to send out and report. And so that's our chore today. So let's begin just by recording ourselves making a pivot table. Actually, before we record it, let's do it once, just making the pivot table. And then we'll record ourselves doing the same thing. And then we'll start working with the code. All right, so I'm going to come to Insert, Pivot Table. And yeah, it got the data, has a data range, new worksheet. That sounds great. I'll say okay. All right, so let's see what we want to do. Why don't we do this? Why don't we put the value as the number that we're going to be aggregating? Oh boy, what does that number mean? What is that, 30 million? What does that number mean? So I just brought the value down and made it, you know, the sum of the value. What is that? It's the sum of all the values in that column, and that number means absolutely nothing, right? Because it's got mixed in the enrollment with all the crime reports. If the enrollment wasn't there, we could say, oh, that's the number of reported crimes in the data set. But with the enrollment, it's just worthless. So let's go ahead and bring out, why don't we bring this, the label as a column. And so now that looks, at least we're getting something here that's useful. So our enrollment is 30 million. So what does that number mean? Number of students enrolled? No, because it's like double counting. So each year we're getting their enrollment. So it's like students year enrollment. It's still kind of a bad number. But the rest of these numbers are, besides grand total, are pretty good. We got 30 murders reported. We've got, wow, 300,000 larcenies. That's a lot. Now, of course, we'd like to be able to see it now split out by some other things. So let's go ahead and add state as a row. So now we've got it down to state, but I'd like to be able to bring it into the school and even to the campus level. So to be able to drill down. So we've got really kind of a little bit difficult to work with. What maybe I want to do here is like how do I do this? Right click like Alabama and then expand, collapse entire field. There we go. So now it's a decent table. I'm looking at this table and I'm seeing state numbers, but then I can dig into the different colleges and campuses that we have here as well. And then why don't I go ahead and bring the report year as a filter. So now I could say, hey, I'm just interested in looking at 2008. Maybe I'll come down here and choose Utah. We can compare how Brigham Young University is doing in all these categories compared to the University of Utah. University of Utah is this one. Yeah, still a little difficult to see. Where is arson? That's one thing I was always kind of amazed at. We're going to go back to all instead of just 2008. And arson is, oh, it's column B. We've got 5 arsons. Wow, no one else in Utah has arson. We got 5. It's like our one place that we're able to really beat the University of Utah, number of arsons. Must be a family home evening activity. I don't know, but there we go. Okay, so we built a table, and that's a pretty good table. Maybe we're interested in, yeah. So Utah is what we're really interested in, but we want to present all this other data. So I'd like to build it just this way. So we've got the filter put on here. We've got all these columns, and we actually have Utah expanded. Okay, shall we record ourselves doing that same thing now? I'm going to do that. And you'll want to do this too, because this is going to be the basis of the code that we're going to start working with. So I'm going to delete this sheet. And developer, record macro, control shift E for pivot. And we're just going to do that again. So insert tab, pivot table. But on a new worksheet, that sounds great. I'm bringing the value down to my values. I'm going to put the label on the columns. I'll bring in state, school, and campus for my rows. And then report year for a filter. Let's see. I think I want to do one more thing that I didn't do before. I want to collapse not just at the state level first, but I'm going to collapse at the school level first. So these are collapsed. So let me go ahead and right-click one of these universities, expand collapse, collapse entire field. And then I'll do the same thing for a state. Right-click the state, expand collapse, collapse entire field. And now with that collapsed, I'll come and expand Utah. And that looks like the report that I would like to be able to generate. So I will stop recording. And how many of you are saying, I'm still getting there, I'm not quite recorded? Oh, looks like you came along with me, or you're not trying. One of the two is, either one's fine. Okay, so now let's go take a look at the code that got recorded. So opening up my code. Got a module here, module 1. Ooh, I named it macro 1. That's kind of a bad name. I'm going to change the name here to be build pivot table. Keyboard shortcut is Control-Shift-P. That looks great. Apparently, I was in cut copy mode when I started this, and so it took me out. I don't need that line. I'm going to get rid of that. So you may or may not have that line. That's fine. Okay, so first statement then that's really important here is we're adding a sheet. And then we're going to look down here. And what do you think the problem is going to be here? Like, folks, when I go to run this code again, what is the problem going to be? It's not going to be sheet 2. So this is kind of a good example of where the macro recorder is recording what's happening, but it's almost useless to be able to run this again. So we're going to have to do a little bit of editing here. So any thoughts on what we should do for that sheet? Here, what we're trying to do is make sure that the sheet that we just created is active. Go ahead. So the suggestion here, one possibility is, why don't we just, right after we create it, we could change the name to make sure that's the name. That would work pretty well, except in the very likelihood that there's already a sheet with that name. Because if I build a pivot table and then go build it again, there's already going to be one with that name. And so that would be a problem. So we could do something that says, like, when you go to build this, let's first delete the sheet that has our pivot table's name. But it's probably going to be useful for us to build multiple pivot tables, because we'll probably say, you know what, I want to run the code to build this pivot table, and then I'll configure this one a little bit differently, configure this one differently, and have a few different kind of starting points. So that would work. Probably not the way I want to tackle. Other thoughts? Yeah. Yes. What you're saying is, when we add that sheets.add statement is going to return a reference to the sheet that was just added. We don't need to know its name if we have captured the reference to it. I like that one. Let's give it a shot. So I'm going to say dim, and I think I'm just going to call it S, dim S as a worksheet. Now, instead of sheets.add, I will say set S equal to sheets.add. That will add the sheet, and I now have a handle to refer to that sheet to do whatever I want to with it. So we're going to look here at our pivot table in just a second, but since we're dealing with the sheet, I'm going to come here and say, so this is actually saying select it, but the truth is, when you add a sheet, it is going to be the active sheet. And so I'm going to delete this line. We don't need that. We could say s.select, but it is going to be active. That's kind of where I was headed with that, but we don't need this either. But Yeah, but this is going to be interesting here because we've got sheet 2 built in here. So that's going to be something we'll have to deal with. Okay, so let's take a look at this statement here. This is not a simple statement. But if we kind of go to pick it apart, it won't be too bad. So active workbook, that says great. Whatever workbook is active, that's fantastic. We're referring to a collection in that workbook. This collection is called pivot caches. Now, probably every time you've thought about a pivot table before in your life, you just think, oh, I'm making a pivot table. What you didn't realize is that every time you create a pivot table, well, when you create a pivot table, step 1 is we've got to get the data from the workbook organized in a way that's ready to support that pivot table. And that is called a pivot cache. So we don't build the pivot table directly on our data in Excel. Step 1 is let's organize the data into a pivot cache, and then we'll build the pivot table on the pivot cache. That happens all in the background. How many of you have ever built a pivot table where the source data was not in Excel, where you connected on to an external database or some external data source to build the pivot table? Anyone? Oh, so yeah, so it looks like we have a little bit of experience with that in class. And so because our pivot table can be built on data that's not even resident in Excel, when they're making this functionality, they said, listen, wherever the data is coming from, let's get it into a common format. And so even if it comes from coming from Oracle or something, or it's coming from Salesforce, we're going to bring that data, put it into a pivot cache, and then we can build multiple pivot tables off of that same pivot cache. So this is saying you could have multiple pivot caches built into this workbook, and we are now getting ready to create a pivot cache for this workbook. Did any of you not get pivot caches.create when you recorded? Well, a few of you did. And the reason that would have happened is that you probably didn't delete the prior pivot table. So when you ran it again, it said, oh, wait, I've already got a pivot cache here. I don't need to create another one. It built it on the same one. We're going to deal with that here as well. But let's go ahead and kind of work through this. So we referred to this collection, all the pivot caches in this workbook, and now we're calling a method of this create. So opening parentheses here, say we're going to passing all of these arguments to the create pivot cache, to the create method of the pivot caches object. So the source type here is Excel database. That means the data is coming from Excel. The source data is this range right here. And version 8. Any of you have a different version besides version 8? It's going to matter what version of Excel you have. That's like the version. It's not the version of Excel. It's the version of the pivot table creation. Now, here's the thing that's strange. After that create, we've got dot create pivot table. That's like, what is going on here? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so that's exactly right. So what the comment, I'm just going to repeat for the, well, probably you all didn't hear it even in the room, is we've created the pivot cache here, right? And because we can have multiple pivot tables built on this pivot cache, we're going right into creating the pivot table. But what this means is you see this dot and then a method name here. That means that whatever's happening before that dot is evaluating to an object. What kind of object do you think we have just created here? It's a pivot cache. And a pivot cache, so not only does this create the pivot cache, it's going to return a reference to the pivot cache where it created it. The same way that when I say sheets.add, it returns a reference to the sheet that was added. So I can capture the sheet that was added here and refer to it later. In this case, we have a reference to that pivot cache that was just created, and now we are saying we want to run a method off of that object. I do not want to do all of this in one step. So I'm going to break this onto the next line. And let us declare a variable PC as a pivot cache. Pivot cache. And now I will set my pivot cache equal to this. So I'm creating a pivot cache and I'm capturing, I'm literally just remembering the memory address where that pivot cache is created. But the whole purpose is now I can refer to this with PC. So now instead of just having create pivot table be attached onto this holder statement, I say, all right, create this table. Let's remember the pivot cache that's created. And now we can say PC dot create pivot table. Show me how comfortable you are with that little step that we did, splitting that line in two. 5, 5, 4, 5, 5, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5. Okay. Now, similar thing here. We're creating a pivot table, but I'm going to need to be able to refer to that pivot table many more times. If we look down here, how are they referring to the pivot table? Active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. Again, that name is probably not going to be the same. So I'm going to have to, like with all the rest of the stuff I'm doing in this code, I'm referring back to that pivot table. We'll do the same trick. We're going to capture that, a reference to that pivot table. So let me dim PT as a pivot table. And now I will say set PT equal to this. Now, one little difference here, you're going to notice that on this create statement, there's parentheses around the argument list. The reason the parentheses were there is because we were doing something with that return value. What were we doing? We were referring to that object to run the create pivot table statement. But this one, we weren't doing anything with what comes back. And so you'll notice there are no parentheses here. But now we are doing something with the return value. What are we doing? We're just capturing it in the variable. And so we're going to have to add parentheses around the argument list here. Okay, so I've got the structure of those two built, but we do need to go back and actually get this configured for the data that we're working with. All right, what is the problem with this right here? First problem is that's kind of unnecessarily broken onto two lines. I am going to break this onto two lines, but I'm going to do it after a comma. So I'm not like splitting in the middle of a line. You can leave it just the way it is if you want, but so we're creating a pivot table and we're saying, listen, the destination of the pivot table is going to be here. Sheet 2, row 3, column 1. Now you'll notice that this is a string, but very, very often in VBA, when I have a string that refers to a range, I can actually just have like an actual reference to a range there. And we could rebuild this string because we could ask what the name of the sheet that we just added. We could ask what s.name is and we can concatenate it on here. Or it turns out we can just replace this string with a reference to a range. So it's going into row 3, column 1. So that is column 1, that's A3. I'm going to do it that way. I'm just going to say s.range A3. We're telling it to be named pivot. Oh, whoops. Somehow I got in pivot table. I didn't mean to be here, but let's go ahead and finish this one off. We're naming it pivot table. The truth is, if we don't give it a name, I think Excel is going to give it a name anyway. So I'm just going to get rid of where we're naming it. If I try to give it a name and it's the name of an existing pivot table, as long as it's on a different sheet, I think it would be okay. But I'm just going to let Excel come up with a name for that. So I'm going to delete that and its comma. I don't know. I probably don't have to have the default version anyway. The default version will probably default to 8 anyway. But I'm just going to leave that in and bring it up onto one line. Okay, so once we've got the pivot cache, we are going to build the pivot table that way. Oof. Let's go back and take a look at what we might have to change here. And a similar thing, I've got source data. I'm going to bring this down onto a line by itself. So put an underscore there, get rid of this one. So this is the reference to like the whole data that we're building. So the crime data, the sheet's going to be named the same. Why might I want to change the address here? So we're going to row 23,000 and something. Yeah, I'd like this to work like next year when I bring in more data. And so I think I want to make that to be dynamic. Well, no trouble. So if I look at my crime data, it already has a code name. It's just called data here. So and it's from row 1, column 1, so the very first cell, like all the data on this sheet. So I'm just going to refer to that as data because that's the code name for that same worksheet. Dot, and then a sheet has a property. Oh no, it's a property of a range. Let me go to a particular range, A1. And then how do I refer to all of the contiguous data from a particular cell? Anybody remember this? So used range would do it for us. Where I was headed was start at A1 and get the current region, because the current region will expand that out. But this is probably the only data that's on here. And so used range would do it. I like that even better. We can get rid of this one. And let's just say data.used range. So that is all of the data on the sheet. Now, this is going to be a problem if someone has come over here on the crime data sheet and put like a note over here. And so that would, because this would be in the used range, but if I was on A1, did the current region, it would skip by this. But I like used, I think used range is a really valuable one to see. So let's go ahead and leave that one in our code. Oof. Questions? Let's go ahead and run it to this point and just see if that part works. What should happen at this point? We should get a new sheet. We're building a new pivot cache, even though we might not need to. We'll add some logic around that. And then we're building a pivot table on that sheet. So I'm going to put stop right here because I'm not really ready to run. I haven't even thought about what we have to change on the rest of this. I'll stop this. I think I'm ready to run it. So let me, don't quite need that as wide as I have it. I'm back to my sheet. I'm going to delete sheet 2 and press Control Shift, what I call it, Control Shift P. Hey, looks pretty good. I've got a new sheet here. It's got a pivot table on it. It's not configured yet, but I certainly couldn't have built a pivot table unless I got that pivot cache created. So now let me come here to my immediate window. Let's just count how many pivot caches I have. So workbook.pivot caches, it's a collection, so I should be able to ask for the count. Now, right now, there's only one. And the reason is when you delete a pivot table, if there are no other pivot tables that are on that same pivot cache, Excel says, we don't need this pivot cache anymore, and it gets rid of it. But you stop my code here. Let me leave this page in place, come back to crime data and run again, Control Shift P. And now let me ask how many pivot caches there are. Now we've got 2. I don't need 2 because these 2 pivot tables are built on the same data. These should be the same pivot cache. Do you want to solve the pivot cache problem first? And it's not a huge problem. It's just going to unnecessarily use extra memory. Or should we get the pivot table going and then come back and do the pivot cache? I think I like that better. Let's realize that we've got a problem with a pivot cache that we've got to solve. But let's get the pivot table going, and then, time permitting, we'll address the issue with the pivot cache. All right, so let's take a look and see what's next. Again, here we're selecting row 3, column 1. I don't think there's any reason to select that. So I'm going to get rid of this line here as well. And now we've got a huge block here. Oh boy. With active sheet dot pivot tables, pivot table 2. That is how it recorded, but how should I refer to the pivot table? That's how it recorded the pivot table we just created. How should I refer to the pivot table we just created? PT, excellent. All right, so we called create pivot table here, and we captured the return value in this variable PT. So anywhere that we're referring to the pivot table, we can just say PT. It's gonna, this code is actually pretty hideous code, and we are gonna simplify it dramatically. Now I'm trying to figure out why it even recorded this. What did I do that made it say that we should do this? Column grand true, has auto format true, display error string, false, display null string. Yikes, I don't remember doing anything that did this. Anyone have any idea why it's what has happened here?
Maybe those are the default values for.
I think that's exactly right. If you didn't hear that, he said, I think those are probably just the default values. Hey, that is really great. And so thank you so much, Macro Recorder, for recording this, because if there's something I want to change, I see exactly how to change all these different properties. The truth is, I'm fine with the defaults. And so I could either leave this here, or I could just get rid of it. After all, it's the default. I'm just going to get rid of it. I'm trying to simplify this code. So we'll get rid of it. It wouldn't hurt at all to leave it there. If you're thinking, wow, maybe I'd like to go back and fiddle with some of these, then that would be great. All right, let's look at this next with statement. And let's see if we can remember what we did that did this. So with active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. Oh, and from that pivot table, what are we asking for? The pivot cache. So how do we say this? PC. Refresh on open is false. Missing items limit. Yeah, refresh on open false. I think I'm fine with that. I don't really need to refresh this when we open the workbook. Missing item limit. Excel missing items default. That sounds like the default as well. I don't think I'm going to put this one on. This one's probably the default as well, but I'm going to leave this one in place. But now that I've got a with statement with only one, or with clause with only one with statement in it, I think I'm just going to simplify that and say this is PC refresh on file open false. In fact, I probably want to move that up to right where I created the pivot cache. I'm just going to put that, it would be fine to leave it there, but once I get building this, I'm going to want to keep that together. So I've created the cache, I've set this property of the cache, and then we're moving on. Excellent. What else we got here? Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. We're doing something with this. Excel repeat all labels. This is repeat all labels. It looks like we're calling a method, repeat all labels, and we're passing it this constant. I wonder what that constant is. I don't know that it really matters what it is. I'm just curious. It's 2. So we're saying repeat all labels. I'm not sure what that is, but I think I'm going to leave it in place. But I'm going to change this to PT. And I might comment that out later and see if it changes anything, whatever. But this now looks like what's happened. This is the first time that it has done something in like direct that I can like identify. I remember doing that. What is this one? This one is we're putting something into the values column. So active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. Great. I'm going to PT that. So we're calling add data field. So we're going to, we're putting a data field, right? We're putting in one of these data fields. Which one is it going to be? It's going to be, let's see, add data field. What are our other ones? So it looks like add data field that is what we do to put something over here. These are the data, apparently these are the data fields. So we don't have to tell it its values because that's what we're referring to with add data field. Now, so we're putting a data field here, and we've got a pivot field called value. That's right, it's this one right here that it's talking about. But what are we doing to identify that? How are we getting down to that? Yeah, we're going back to that same pivot table, PT. So we're adding a data field, and we're adding the pivot field called value from our pivot table. That looks great. Sum of value, I didn't change that, but now that I'm seeing it in the code, I'm thinking I kind of want to put that one. Maybe I'll just put total here. And it's going to be a sum. Whoops, it's going to be a sum. That's what I want. Okay, great. So we've got that one converted over to use our current pivot table. Let's look at this with, and let's see what this next one is. So with our pivot table, we are changing what one of these pivot fields is. So we're changing the properties of this pivot field. We've got a with statement here. We are changing the orientation. Here's where we're making this into a column field, right? And this is where this was the label. We made this the column label. Position 1, that's going to be the default. So I don't think I need this. And now I've got a with only one thing in it. So let me go ahead and get down to my pivot table. Get rid of the proper pivot table. And so now that's the field that I want to work with. I'm going to put that then as a single line and get rid of my with statement. Well, we are throwing out code left and right. I think I want to run to this point and just see how we're coming. So I'll put a stop here. Get rid of my other stop. Go back to my data and run the code. Hey, look at that. Looks great. So yeah, we've got our values here. We've got our columns. We're coming along. Whew. I'll stop this code. We'll just move on to the next one. In fact, now as I look at this next block of 3 statements, here's where we're putting our state, school, and campus. These are all of our row columns that we made. And we'll notice that this one has, has a different value here. But again, I think these are going to go in the order that I add them. So I think I can get rid of the position. And I can change this to pivot table on all of these to PT. And then get them down to a single line as well. Ooh, I like this code better already. But I'm really not sure if I'm okay with the order. I'm certain that these might go in reverse order. I'm not sure that they go on the top or the bottom when you just add it without specifying what its position is. So I think I'm going to run that again. And when I say I'm not sure, I'm not saying if I didn't know what I was talking about, I wasn't sure. I'm saying I'm really not sure. Yeah, I did do this example last semester, but I don't remember it. So I'm going to come back to crime data, Control-Shift-P. And then it looks like it put them in that order. So state was first, it went first, then school and campus, they come down lower. Great news. Okay, let's look at our next one. Here's where we're making the filter for the year. Again, position 1, we're not going to need it. We're making it the filter. So this is going to be a lot of the same. That's a reference to the pivot table. That'll get our report year in place. What are these next ones? I'm selecting A15. And then, so here's where we are telling the detail not to show for the school and for the state. Okay, so pivot table. Oh, yeah, that looks like those need to change there. I don't have to be selecting. Let me get rid of these selects. When I was recording it, I had to select it to be able to change it, but certainly don't need to select it there. And then same thing for this next one. Change that to pivot table, show detail false. Active window, small scroll down, 24. I don't think I need to scroll either when I'm making this. Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2, pivot table, pivot items, Utah. Show detail true. I was somehow expecting that I would have to collapse some other detail, but this looks okay. So pivot table, PT, pivot field, show detail true. There we go. Wow, that code is way simpler. That, if I've done everything right, that should show everything. I'm not entirely sure it's going to work. Let's give it a shot. Oh, and I guess I don't actually have to activate that sheet because I can run it from code. Did it give me Utah? Yeah, it broke that out just exactly the way I wanted it to do. Outstanding. Questions on manipulating the pivot table? Yes.
It says state, school, and campus. Could you make that all one line, or is that possible?
Help me find where you're talking about.
Where it's up a little bit.
Up. Oh, these right here.
It's all each one of those is doing the same thing, but could you make it all?
So the question is, so right now we are setting all of these to be row fields. Could we do this all in one statement? Could I simplify even more? And the answer is I don't think so, because what I'm doing is I am changing a property. I'm changing this property to take on a new value. So I've got 3 different properties that I have to change. And the sequence is going to be important because whichever one I do first is going to be the top level and the next level and below. So I think these need to stay as 3 separate lines. All right. So let's come and deal with our pivot cache issues. How many pivot caches do we have now? I got 5 pivot caches. I wonder how much memory my workbook's taking at the moment. Because this is a fair amount of data, 20,000 rows of data. It's a fair amount of data. I've never looked to see how much bigger that makes the pivot table. Let's do that real quick, or how big it makes the workbook. So I'm going to save this. Go ahead and save it with indicating this term. We are in winter 23. I'm just curious how big that file is at the moment. So winter 23. Yeah, it's 1.5 megabytes. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to clear those off by hand. I don't know what this is. I do not know what this is going to do to the pivot tables that are dependent on it. I'm just going to say this workbook dot pivot caches. Ooh, I'm not sure how to delete it. Delete a pivot cache. I don't see a delete here. So we'll go pivot caches sub 1. Actually, I'm not sure how to delete a pivot cache. If only we had some connection to a worldwide network of information that we could ask. Okay, so I kind of expect to see something there. It wasn't delete and it wasn't remove. Pivot caches. Sometimes it's at the object level. Parent item create count application. Maybe you don't remove pivot caches. They get removed automatically when you. It looks like there's not a method to do it. If someone Googled it, you could probably find out if there is a way to do it. But I'm just going to go ahead and remove off these sheets. So I've got crime data. Let me take everything else and remove it. So it says you're not allowed to remove it. And if you remove the pivot table that depends on it, it deletes it automatically. Okay, so now if I look at my pivot caches, there should be none because I have no pivot tables. No pivot caches. I'm going to save my workbook. And I was like at 1.5 megabytes. Let's see where I am now. Oh yeah, I'm back down to 0.7 megabytes. So having those the pivot tables themselves weren't that much data, right? They were small. So yeah, having those extra pivot tables is kind of unnecessarily making my workbook large. So let's take a look at what we might do to figure this out. So before I create just go off and create that pivot cache, let's just check to see if we've got an appropriate pivot cache here. So I'm going to look across my collection of pivot caches. I'll do this with a for each loop, for each, and I'll use my PC variable here to drive this for each loop. For each PC in this workbook, dot pivot caches. Next. Debug dot print. PC dot, do I have something I can print off my pivot cache? Pivot cache have a name? Pivot cache doesn't have a name. Parent query type. I don't know what query type is, but I'm going to print it. Okay, so right now there are no pivot caches. So when I run this to create a pivot table, I shouldn't get anything from that. But the next one, I'm going to go ahead and put a label so I can see what I'm printing here. This is my pivot cache. It's my pivot cache. Okay, so I'm going to run this. It built my pivot table, but didn't print anything for that pivot cache. I'm going to run it again. So it doesn't like that. Let's see if there's something I can print here. PC dot connection. No connection on this one. Presumably these are properties that are used for pivot caches that are configured in different ways. Background query application. Application would just be to Excel. Index is connected. Maybe it has an index. Yeah, has an index. I'm just going to print index here. Okay, so that's pivot cache 1. If I run this again, I'm getting pivot cache 1 and pivot cache 2. Right? So as I'm building those pivot caches, they're coming into this collection right here. So now it's possible that someone else could be building pivot caches in this workbook. I got a pivot table built on some other data store. So I don't want to just assume that if there is a pivot cache here, it's the one to use. I'm going to want to check and see if if the data range that we're using is the data range that's the right data range that I'm expecting. So print the pivot cache and the index and PC dot. How do I get to the range? I think I've got a note on that. It's called source data. All right, I'm going to run that one and let's see if that's telling us what the source data is something that we can understand. Yeah, source data, that looks good. So now we're expecting to have that source data. So I'm going to need to identify the data that I want up to that point. So where did I refer to that source data? Right here, used range, data used range. So I'll just use that same thing up here. In fact, I'll do it right in here. I'm going to say if data used range address. Before I do the if statement, let me put it up here on the same line, because when you ask for the address of a range, it usually puts like $signs in it. So let me run this and just see what that looks like. So I'm going to need to check for equivalency R1 to C1. Oof. That's going to be tough for me to see where it ends up. This looks okay. 2, 3, 1, 6, 4. So why don't I do this? Why don't I ask if the address of whatever this is matching that one? So pc.sourceData. Now this is just a string. And so, how could I get to the address of that? I could say my data sheet, which is called data.range. I'm talking about that range there, dot address. So now that should identify the range based on that string and return the address. I think that's going to give me an address that looks the same. Create another one. Worksheet failed. Not that range. PC.data. I think this is a string. EYPE name. That's a string. Data. Oh, I may not need to have it on the data. Let me just ask for this because it has the name of the sheet built into it. Range crime data. I need to figure out some way to be able to identify that that is the right one. Let me just look at my notes here. Looks like last time I did this, I actually built the string to match. Okay, we can do that. So let me declare a variable up here, dim address as a string. And I'm going to need to get myself a string that looks like this. Okay, that doesn't sound too hard. string. Thank you. Okay, so address is going to start off by equaling the name of my crime data sheet. So data.name. I'm comfortable using data to refer to it because that's the code name of it. And so even if the user changes the name of the sheet, we'll still get the proper name for it. So data.name, I'm going to concatenate onto that an exclamation point. And then we got to get R1, C1. Oh, that's okay, because I know it's going to start, that's the first cell, it's going to start there. So let me keep doing that one here, R1, C1, colon, R, and then I'm after the last row of my contiguous data. So I think that number will be like source data dot rows dot count. Sorry, or data sheet dot rows dot count. That's how many rows there are. So I want data sheet dot used range dot rows dot count. Does that give me the same number? Let me set up a little more room here. 23164. 23164. Great. So that expression gives me that number. And then we're looking for a column. And we could go through and actually calculate that column number as well. But I'm anticipating the data to be in the same structure. In fact, for the rest of my thing to work, it's going to have to be in the same structure. I'm really only anticipating having more rows added. So with a little work, we could get that 7 to be dynamic, but I don't think there's a compelling reason to do it. So now I can compare the pivot cache's source address to my variable that's just called address. Let me run this one and see what we get. Now that looks like a string that I can compare and check to see if the pivot cache I'm looking at is built onto the same data set that I'm about to try to build onto. Okay, so now instead of printing this, I'm just going to say if my PC source data is equal to my address, I found a suitable pivot cache. What do I want to do? I'm just going to exit 4. EXIT 4. Now, I'm going to exit 4 because at this point, my pivot cache is connected on to that pivot cache. I use this variable to find out, oh, that's a good pivot cache. My PC variable is already attached to it. So if I get all the way out of this loop and my pivot cache, if I actually found a suitable one, pivot cache will be bound onto it. If it's not, then pivot cache is going to be nothing. If PC is nothing, then we want to do this. So I'm going to go through this loop and I'm going to hook on my PC variable onto each pivot cache until I find one that has just the address I'm looking for. If I find that, then get me out of the loop. PC is currently attached onto that pivot cache. But if I never, oh, no, I'm not binding it. It's going to be attached to the last one no matter what. Exit 4. Oh, I've never tried to do that. That's a really interesting idea. Let me try that and see what happens. If, then, else if. No, I don't want else if, I just want else. I think this might work. This has a good chance of working. So, because when I get to next, it's going to connect PC onto the next one. So that means unless I find a match, I'm going to be setting it to nothing each time. Put a stop here and just see what we got. It might, yeah. This for each may not like that. Let's find out. Looks like it liked it okay. What is PC? Yeah, so I found it. Let me make it so that the comparison fails. So I'm just going to change my string up here. So address, instead of C7, I'll make it C71. So now it won't find a match. And our PC cache is nothing. Yeah. Who said that? That was really smart. I like it. You around next semester? Be my TA, anything? No? Ooh, neat. Hey, speaking of that, if any of you are interested in having more experience with VBA, I would love to have at least 2 TAs for the fall. So if you're gonna be here in fall and you think, yeah, I'm kind of getting this, I'd like more experience, email me and we'll set you up to be TA, maybe. Okay. I mean, if you all email me, I certainly can't hire all of you, so, okay. That looks good. So now, when we come out here, if it's nothing, then we didn't find a suitable match and we're going to need to bind on to it. I like it. I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to get rid of all of my other pivot tables. Delete those. Delete. I'll stop this. Let's run it again. Let's hope this works. Okay, that built a pivot cache. That looks, or built a pivot table. I run it again. Built another one. And let's ask how many pivot caches we have. It's because I'm looking at 71 all the time. So let's try that again. Delete this one. Got it 3 times. Just 1 pivot cache. So now if we save this, how many did we have before? We had like 5. I'm going to run this 3 more times. We've got 6 pivot tables. So back when we were before with those multiple pivot caches, we were at 1.5 megabytes. I'm going to save this now and go look at it. We're still less than a megabyte here. So excellent. Okay. Ooh. We got 10 minutes to go for me to give you your value for today's lecture. Any other questions or things you'd like to do with the pivot cache? Truth is, or pivot table, I'm not totally opposed to dismissing you 10 minutes early, but if there's a burning question, I'd be glad to answer it. If not, have a great weekend. There's a project due tonight, so if you have questions, I got a few minutes here. Come down and ask your questions. And we will see you next Monday, weather permitting. All right, class dismissed. Thank you. Thank you. You're too kind.